also collaboration with Carlotta Escutia, but it's looking at the East Antarctic Ice Sheet during the early Pliocene. So why look at the Pliocene and why the East Antarctic Ice Sheet? Well, up here you see this reconstructed temperatures for different time periods. Bear in mind the sort of changing time scale here. But if you look here, future warming scenarios, we're getting into +2, +4 degrees over here. And so there are scenarios where we're even warmer than we were during the last interglacial Eemian. And so we really need to go further and further back to find a climate in the geological past that was similar to these very warm scenarios. And I'll be talking about this period here, the Pliocene. And the same goes for when we look at CO2 concentrations. Here the timescale is flipped, so going from 0 to 5 million years here. And we're currently up at 390 or 400 parts per million. And you need to go back into Pliocene times to find a similar ancient analog, as it were. Why the East Antarctic ice sheet? Well, here you can see, so here we have sea level rise potential. So within Greenland we have about 7 meters. West Antarctic ice sheet we have another approximately 7 meters. But the East Antarctic ice sheet contains about, over 50 meters of global sea level rise. So it's a really important component of the cryosphere, essentially. Now, one of the ways that we look at the past history of the Antarctic ice sheet is looking at marine cores taken from around the continent on the continental shelf. So I am now extending the area into the marine realm. Sorry about that. But you might be surprised to see that there are actually not that many sites where we have long-term records that go back beyond the last glacial maximum. They're very restricted, sort of starting from the early 70s. In 2019, there'll be a couple more long-term records, hopefully from this area. But they're very far and few between. But they're really the areas, or these are really the records where we can get this long-term history. So I'll be talking about this site here, IODP 218. This map here just shows you, you can see these areas in blue. So this is parts of the Antarctic ice sheet that are grounded below sea level. And these are the areas of the ice sheet that are particularly vulnerable to climatic change and may collapse in the future, or that is certainly the worry. The West Antarctic ice sheet, as you can see, much of it is grounded below sea level, up to 1 kilometer below sea level in many areas. It's been known since the 1970s that this area is potentially vulnerable and could collapse. Less is known about the East Antarctic ice sheet, but now we do know that there are these large basins here where also a large proportion of the ice sheet is grounded below sea level, and these could also be vulnerable to collapse. And I'm going to talk about this basin here, the Wilkes subglacial basin. You've got about 3 to 4 meters of global sea level rise in here, so it's quite significant. So how do we use these marine sediment cores to look at past ice sheet behavior? Well, here's an example from West Antarctica. So here's the coring site here, the drill site Cape Roberts. You can see this red dot. And what they've done here, so this is on currently it's an ice shelf here floating, and they've drilled through the ice shelf and down into the sediments, and you get a particular type of sediment that is deposited underneath this ice shelf. Now, when one goes down core, and this core extends many hundreds of meters below the sea floor, you find periods where you get this, the diatomaceous oozes, if you like. And these types of sediment are only deposited when the coring site in the past would have been open marine conditions, so very different from what it is today. And during this period, it's been suggested that you would have had collapse of the West Antarctic ice sheet and, of course, sea level rise with it. There are other sediments within the core that show that the site would have been totally covered by ice, a grounded ice sheet, and you would have got subglacial sediments. So this is mainly related to the dynamics of the West Antarctic Ice Sheet, and we wanted to do something similar with the East Antarctic Ice Sheet. So is there any evidence of possible collapse of the East Antarctic Ice Sheet during this warm Pliocene era? Well, there's, I suppose, two main lines of evidence. So one of the pieces of evidence is that during the Pliocene, we know we had sea level that was about 20 meters higher. So if we get 7 meters from collapsing our West Antarctic ice sheet, and then we get another 7 meters from getting rid of our Greenland ice sheet, we still have some sea level missing. And it's been suggested that this missing sea level could have come from partial collapse of the East Antarctic ice sheet. So there's been several modeling studies that have looked at this, and here you can see at the top, here is the modern ice sheet, and you can see here during Pliocene times, not only do you have the collapse of the West Antarctic ice sheet, but you have partial collapse in here into the subglacial basin. And this diagram down here just shows a similar thing. You can see these blue colors is a comparison between modern and Pliocene, and you can see this big change here and here over the West Antarctic ice sheet. Very similar here. This is a model just run for 5,000 years with Pliocene-like conditions, collapse of West Antarctica, beginning to collapse in here into the Wilkes subglacial basin. This here is just focusing in on this part here into this basin, and this study suggested that, in fact, to cause this rapid collapse, all you need to do, imagine this is the coastline here, so you have the sea here and the ice sheet here. All you need to do is remove this plug of ice along the coast at the head of this large basin, and once you remove this plug, you get very rapid retreat and collapse of this ice sheet down this backward slope into these deep basins. So what we wanted to do is, okay, well, this is what the models are predicting. Can we find some geological evidence for this actually on the shelf directly at the mouth of this large trough? So the area is here. Here you see a map of Antarctica. This is just a swath bathymetric image of the seafloor. Here you can see this is the continental shelf. I'll be talking a little bit about this core. Here's the slope and going into the deep ocean. And you can take a seismic line across this transect here, and this is the seismic data that we collect. Here's the shelf edge. These sediments essentially were deposited before there was an ice sheet on the East Antarctica. These types of sediments above this U3, these are sediments that were deposited at the initiation of the East Antarctic ice sheet. So ice sheet initiation's around 33 million years. You would have had a sort of alpine-style glaciation during that time. And then you get this very rapid outbuilding of the shelf, and that signifies large, big ice sheets on East Antarctica advancing right to the shelf edge here. Okay, so what do we see when we core these sediments and we look at this Pliocene time period? So here again is the core site. Now the problem that you have with marine cores is often if you want to do any sort of sedimentological interpretation, you have a piece of core that is sort of that wide, and that's what you've got to work with. So it's not much, particularly when you compare to a terrestrial sedimentologist that might have a huge beach section or something like that. So the technique I've been developing is looking at the microstructures of the sediment. So to take samples from the core and make them into thin sections and look at the microstructures of the sediments, and from that try and interpret how these sediments were deposited. And we came up with a few sediment types, and the type you see here, all these green and red lines are just classed fabric. So they're the orientation of the A-axes of lots of these small stones clasts within the core. And where you get lots of them agreeing with each other, giving a very strong directional signal, this is very classic actively transported sediment. You get, if you went to a till section somewhere here in Sweden, you would very likely get this very strong fabric signal. So this is very good indication that this bit of sediment here was deposited at the base of an ice sheet. So at this point, the ice sheet must have been advanced right close to the shelf edge when this sediment was deposited subglacially. Okay, this weird and wonderful picture is what some of these sediments look like under the microscope. So in many ways, what you see here, the sort of structures you see here are reflected in large-scale structural geology, so they would be familiar to many structural geologists. But in some of these sediments that have been deposited below these ice sheets, we see things like these rotation structures. So these are individual clasts that have been rotated while they're being deformed by the ice sheet, and they wrap a coat of a matrix around them within very fine shear zones, and you get the shearing causes lineations of clasts, and it fractures clasts, and you also get things like necking structures where lots of smaller clasts are forced between two larger ones. So these are classic structures that you get in subglacial sediment. If you crawl under a glacier and collect dirt, this is the kind of thing you will see. Here you also get very similar structures as well. Maybe you can see here this large core grain and this slightly lighter halo around it. This is clay, and it's been rotating and gathering the clay, and this is why you get this nice this coat here. So these are all evidence of subglacial deposition. And then just very quickly, this contrasts very strongly with sediments deposited in open marine water, open marine conditions. So during open marine conditions, you get this very finely laminated structures. You do get some deformation, which is related to depositional processes, but it's very different. So finally, in conclusion, we can look at our core, and you can see these blue colors. These blue colors are periods of time when there's been an ice sheet over the coring site, and the green colors are when we've had open marine conditions. And what you can see, here's the time frame. So we have about 1 million years, and in 1 million years we've had 3 or 4 advances of the East Antarctic Ice Sheet right to the shelf edge, and between then we've had periods where it's also retreated back, probably at least to the coastline, maybe even further inland, where you've had open marine conditions. And what this is telling us is that even a huge, large ice sheet such as the East Antarctic Ice Sheet is really sensitive to climatic and ocean changes and can advance and retreat very rapidly over very short timescales. Thanks, Benedict.
Are there questions for Benedict?
I have one question, and I should maybe know the answer, but I don't. What is the climate forcing for the model results that you showed? Because, I mean, Pliocene climate forcing is maybe a bit uncertain, and maybe these uncertainties transform into the model results, and there was no indication of that. So I maybe tend to believe more in your reconstructions.
Yeah, so I'm not an ice sheet modeler, but I know there's been a lot of debate regarding that. So I think the main ice sheet model was Pollard and DeConto's ice sheet model. And when they first did it, so there was a paper published in Nature by Karis Cook that showed that there had been substantial collapse of the ice sheet from deep sea records. And then when Pollard and DeConto tried to model it, they couldn't get it to work. It just wouldn't retreat. And I think then finally they had to adjust it so that they have this. It's to do with the carving process, this ice cliff failure process that they inbuild into it. And if you have this ice cliff failure process, then they can retreat the grounding line substantially further back. And the ice plug model is also, I think, another Nature paper as well, which is a different group in Germany that sort of suggests you just need, and they say 80 millimeters sea level rise will get rid of that ice plug. So that's what they say in the paper, which is kind of scary, right? Because you've got 3 to 4 meters of sea level rise then trapped behind that. So,
yeah. First, for people who aren't familiar with the Pliocene, this is truly terrifying because the Pliocene CO2 was only 400 or 450 ppm. We're already at 400. We could easily go to 600, 800, or 1,000, depending on how much coal we burn. So there are really big changes ahead of us, and that's why it's so incredibly important to understand this. And so my question was, in the West Antarctic ice sheet, the uncorking of the ice sheet by breaking up the ice shelf plays a big role in whether it deglaciates, and that's in turn very sensitive to warm water, the local warm water condition, which is one thing that makes it so hard to figure the forcing. So in this region, is it also the situation that the ice shelf is is what's holding things back, or is it a different dynamic that would be forcing it?
Well, not only ice shelf, but sea ice is particularly important in this. And so it's been suggested that sea ice or reduction in sea ice may have been the thing that triggered this large-scale collapse. This site is also particularly vulnerable because it has one of these deep troughs that goes from the continental shelf edge right to the ice front. And it's been shown, maybe not in the East Antarctic cases, but certainly Antarctic Peninsula, West Antarctica, that you're getting warm water coming in along these troughs. So, yes, it's certainly potentially vulnerable.
One last question then.
I was wondering about the advance you're talking about of the glacier. Did I understand correctly that your data indicates that grounded ice advance where you have open ocean today?
Yes. Yeah, even during a warm Pliocene period. And part of that is because essentially where you have, so this is where it gets complicated as well, but if you, for example, reduce sea ice, you also add a lot of moisture to the whole system. And if you think of East Antarctica now, it's so cold that actually if you warm the temperature a bit, you're going to increase snowfall and things like that. So it's not necessarily a case of warmer climate causing just collapse into the basins, but it's quite clear that even in these warm Pliocene periods, you've also had the ice sheet advancing right or very close to the shelf edge, which really suggests it's dynamic like we see in the Quaternary. It's very dynamic, even during Pliocene times.
Okay, so thanks to all the speakers of this last RA session again. And that wraps it up for the RA sessions. I'll just announce that we have now one last point on the agenda before the closing remarks, and that's monitoring in Stordalen and the carbon cycle.